Jordan Peterson is a controversial character. He's like Marmite. A lot of people love him, a lot of people hate him. So I wanted to invite my good friend Jamie Wrate onto the show and talk about where he lands with him. Is he someone to be feared? Is he someone to be applauded? Who knows? Have a look and you might be able to decide for yourself. Take care. Bye. Accept the terrible responsibility of life with eyes wide open. Jordan Peterson. Okay, we are live. So thank you everyone who has tuned in. It's Thursday. I'm Laurence Johns. This is the Magnificent Man Project group. So this is Thursday for Knowledge. If you're not watching this in the group and you're watching this on YouTube, then please go and join the Magnificent Man Project group on Facebook, and that means you'll be able to get involved with these conversations, and you'll be able to ask questions as we go live in the comment area of the broadcast, whatever it's called these days. So here we are, Thursday for Knowledge. It's 3:30. Let's go. I've invited an old friend of mine, Jamie Wrate, to come in and have a little talk about Jordan Peterson. And the reason I've done that is, and the reason that this was called Jordan Peterson, Hero or Villain, is because I personally think there's been a lot of controversy around Jordan Peterson, especially a few years back. There was much more controversy about Jordan Peterson. And it seems to me at the moment that there seems to be some form of reevaluation, and it seems to me like maybe that's coming from him, that maybe there's been a change and a softening in him, or maybe he was just exploiting sound bites to get noticed in the first place, and now we're seeing a more measured version. So the reason I invited Jamie on was a few years ago. Jamie wrote a book called The Shadow of Jordan Peterson, looking at Jordan Peterson. So I've invited Jamie on to kind of talk about Jordan Peterson then, Jordan Peterson now, where we are with him now, and what we think he's up to. Jamie, I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself now, because you'll do a much better job than I will.
Sure. Hi, Laurence. Really nice to see you after so many years, and yeah, you've been a leading light for me. You were the man who led my primary integration training when I first learned Mankind Project, and it was just absolutely huge. So I'm really honored to be here.
Thank you.
About good memories and relights makes new ones. I also just got the Thursday for Knowledge thing. I'm slow at puns sometimes, so I was having a little chuckle to that. Very nice. So yeah, I'm Jamie Wrate. I was a history and politics teacher in South London when I knew Laurence in some I groups, the initiate groups of the Mankind Project, and after I did my initiation of Mankind Project. And that was a period of a lot of change and introspection, and including diving into shamanistic practices. I quit my job as a teacher in 2016 and moved to Brazil to spend time with a shaman and psychotherapist called Xamam Alba Maria, who mixes indigenous practice with Jungian dynamics and Jungian psychotherapy. And we do all sorts of study and training. And eventually what I thought was going to be a quick in and out healing process, and my return to my life started to become my life. And I've returned for 4 months every year for the last 4 years. And hopefully, COVID willing, I'll be back in November this year. I've been outside the UK since then. And I got quite interested in Jordan Peterson for different reasons, primarily because a friend at a wedding started talking about him with great passion and in a really confusing way for me. He had a lot of fear about a neo-Marxist kind of takeover of the world. And this was shortly after Brexit. And I think Trump was just happened, it was about to happen. And there was, you know, fascist or quasi-fascist in Brazil and India and the Philippines. And I just kind of thought, where are these neo-Marxists? What's going on? I started to listen to Jordan Peterson. There was a lot of interest and engagement in MKP UK chat, the online mail thing. And I guess, to be honest, part of me got really triggered by his impact, some things that I perceived in him, which reflected my own process and my own background and wounds as well as a man, but also seemed to me some points about leadership that I felt needed to be looked at, especially since we're coming into some uncertain times. So I wrote a book in literally a kind of dengue fever state and published it. It's a short book. It's probably not as good as the article, but the article was praised by one of my favorite writers, George Monbiot. So I was really pleased by that. I write now and then, but my main practice now is I work in fields of shamanism training with my teacher. And this year I've begun psychotherapy training with the Institute of the Psychosynthesis Trust in London Bridge. And again, thank COVID, at the moment I'm being able to do that with much cheaper rent in Thailand online. That's me.
Great. Well, thanks for being here. I mean, let's just dive in, really, and start talking about Jordan Peterson, because I find him a very interesting character. And also very divisive, and I don't mean divisive just in terms of the sort of people that like him or dislike him, but also divisive just in my own head. You know, it seems to me like there's almost two people in there, and I find that quite difficult to kind of to bring together in my thoughts. And I think probably part of it is he seems to have a very sort of Jungian background, and so and there's some stuff in there that when he talks about it, to me it just goes in as sort of fundamental truth. It's just the same story that I tell myself about the world, you know, like for example, like that we're all monsters, that basically inside of us we all have the potential to be monstrous, and that our life is kind of about that dance between our humans, our sort of spirit and our monstrous self, and the kind of dance between those two, and that it's not healthy to deny the monster that's inside of us. It's healthier when we admit it's there and we sort of acknowledge that it's there. And also, you know, I share his views around personal responsibility being like the first step of anything. Like, our job is to keep our side of the road clean, take responsibility for our lives. And so those sort of things, I can go tick, yeah, I'm with you, you know, tick, I'm with you. And then suddenly, you know, he'll come across and say something like, the kind of the patriarchy is a sort of a mythical construct. It's like it's a new story that's being made up because it's kind of useful for a certain group of people, and there's no kind of legitimacy in fact. And that I kind of find, you know, I find that challenging. I spend a lot of my time thinking about, you know, to me, there's a conflict there between that kind of idea of cleaning up our side of the street, you know, taking on personal responsibility. Part of me thinks, well, hang on, because part of my responsibility that I see as a man is to kind of clean up any injustice that's been done by men. I take that view very seriously, that the role of a modern man being alive today, as we knew in the past, you know, the view was you kind of cleaned up what 7 generations have done and you prepare for 7 generations. That's always been the kind of the role. And so I find his view on that very difficult. And then I find stuff where I find it difficult and interesting, like the sort of his stuff around equality, where
Mm.
I think he got quite wrongly quoted when he said that he said he thinks equality, the idea of equality is evil, right?
Mm.
And then when you read into it further, what he's saying is that fairness and equality of opportunity should be what we're trying to get to. Not
Yeah.
making it so that all people are equal, but making it so everyone has an equal playing field. And I think that, to me, that kind of bit there sums him up in a way where he'll mean one thing, but it will seem like he'll purposely say another because it's going to attract more attention. It's almost like a punk kind of putting his two fingers up to the world so that everyone looks at him.
So he kind of thrives on dissonance or paradox in some way, that he's almost, the way you're describing, he almost sounds like a slightly kind of tricksterish figure. Beneath his kind of tweed, there's actually quite an impishness, perhaps. I think you're right, but I also think that it's probably unacknowledged and is a kind of unconscious dynamic that actually forces kind of inconsistencies that he probably isn't really aware of, is my feeling. Because, let's looking at the thing you said about equality of opportunity versus equality of outcome. The thing is, both of these are, there's not a political party in Britain, apart from probably maybe the National Front of that, the BNP, if they even still exist, that doesn't believe in equality of opportunity. You could ask Jacob Rees-Mogg and you could ask Jeremy Corbyn, do you believe in equality of opportunity? They would both say yes. And I think what he means by equality of opportunity is free market economics and having some tax on the rich, but not a great deal, and don't mess with what's not broken. And probably a lot of people on the left would say that's an interpretation of equality of opportunity, whereas equality of opportunity might be, in Norway, equality of opportunity is, they ban private schools. I'm not sure I'd be in favor of that personally, but that's certainly, it's a pretty solid sounding equality of opportunity. And certainly it would be hard to argue that school funding shouldn't be massively increased to have a genuine equality of opportunity. So what I feel he does quite typically is uses words in a way, I suppose in quite a loose way, in quite a way that I judge to be irresponsible. And actually, although I'm kind of liberal, I'm way liberal to his politics, or left of his politics. But I also feel a kind of conservative rebuke for him. I feel like he's not very responsible with his words. He's not very particular in the choice of his words. So, for example, he recently said that he felt more people had died from modern medicine than had been saved, and got a lot of controversy, and it just didn't stand up to any scrutiny. I saw a doctor writing about it. It was just a ridiculous statement. People used to die of like a rotten tooth. Antibiotics save. Probably most of us would have died 3 times without antibiotics. So these kind of ridiculous claims during a pandemic, when loads of people are being skeptical about science and dying partly because of that skepticism, a public intellectual, I kind of think it's a difference from being a trickster, isn't it? It's like, I kind of think you expect, if someone's on a platform and they're not being Johnny Rotten spitting at the stage and singing God Save the Queen with 2 fingers up to them, but you're actually on a platform that is supposed to, in some sense, accord with the view you have from that platform, that you see further, and that's why you're up on that platform. I think he really misleads his audience. When it comes to politics, I think he misleads his audience in a way that if he's not conscious of, I don't think he's explored a lot of his own consciousness. So I'm happy to give an example now. Now is a good time for one.
Yeah. No, please do. Please do.
I think something that seems really important and something that I've become aware of, and maybe others have, I say listen, is I've been shocked at seeing in alternative communities and kind of hippie type communities, and despite my haircut, I'm a bit of a hippie and I've got a lot of hippie mates. And I've seen stuff I wouldn't believe where people think that Black Lives Matter is racist, is some kind of Marxist front for taking over the world, and think that all lives matter is a reasonable response. And these are all basically fairly thoughtless positions that don't come from empathy and understanding. There's a lack of understanding in these positions. And I think Jordan Peterson here, and I'll just play you a clip, really, really adds to this in an unhelpful way. And I'm just going to play this to you. So this is Jordan Peterson asked about a statement that Candace Owens, who's an African-American woman who works on right-wing talk radio, and is heavily criticized by our own community for her kind of statements. And she's asked about Black Lives Matter, and this is the little bit about what she says and Jordan Peterson's response. And I think it's a good example of his carelessness with language, which to me feels manipulative.
Victim mentality is not cool. I don't know why people like being oppressed. The weirdest thing I've ever heard. I love oppression. We're oppressed. We're under years of slavery, Jim Crow, which, by the way, none of you guys lived through. Your grandparents, and it's embarrassing that you utilize their history. You're not living through anything right now. You're overly privileged Americans.
So basically, there, Candace Owens is basically saying that if you don't live through the Jim Crow, you're not oppressed. There can't be a thing such as oppression anymore for Black people because they no longer have Jim Crow, which obviously you can look at voting suppression in the South now, it still kind of happens. But this is Jordan Peterson's response.
Overly privileged Americans, she said that. And then a few hours or a day or two later, Kanye West, the singer, the artist, tweeted this out. I love the way Candace Owens thinks, and then now he's taking a lot of heat because he's supporting somebody who's from the political right. What did you make of what she had to say?
Well, I think that Candace is commenting about the danger of adopting a victimization oppressor narrative, and it's a narrative that the hard left has really been pushing ever since Marx, of course, that the world is composed of those who are victimized and those who are the oppressors, and everyone successful is an oppressor, and everyone else is a moral victim.
So, in other words, right in this point, he's basically trying to make out that Black Lives Matter is about envy of success. You know, everyone successful is an oppressor, everyone not successful is a victim. And Black Lives Matter is about the fact, and this is from American government statistics, that 3 times more unarmed men, Black men, get killed than unarmed white men. That's just a fact. That's nothing to do with success. That's a fact. You know, I saw recently a lieutenant in the American Army driving a fancy car as a Black man. He got stopped and harassed by the police. The idea that racism doesn't exist and that it's a victim mentality to kind of pretend that it is, seems to me to be buying in actually to the victim mentality of white people who don't want to feel the suffering of their Black brothers and sisters.
Yeah.
So I think not only is it a kind of bypass, he's actually encouraging his white audience to feel like, yeah, this stuff is rubbish. I'm the real victim here because I'm having to swallow all this nonsense from racist Black Lives Matters people. And I saw another one, which I'm not going to play, but where he talks about white privilege. And he's asked about white privilege. And he starts to talk about the danger of people being discriminated against by their race. And that it's the most racist, the other white privilege, this idea that you're guilty by association with being white is the most racist thing that's possible to be. And he starts to talk about the kulaks in Russia, who were slightly wealthier peasants, ex-serf, but they did a little better, ex-slaves, they did a little better, and then they were encouraged to be basically collectivized and killed in all sorts of horrible ways by I guess the poorer peasants and by the bourgeois communists. But he's trying to equate that with the white privilege. So white people are effectively the kulaks. It just doesn't make sense when black people are 16% of the population in America. So the idea that black people are going to rise up and start bullying and, you know, this poor white minority just doesn't make any sense. So what I feel is he's got a preoccupation with these kind of unhelpful emotions and a refusal to see that actually some of these emotions are just a result of social realities. And like you touched on, that sometimes cleaning your side of the street is about going over and crossing the street and filming the police harassing a young black kid who was just walking home and happened to be wearing a hoodie because it's cold and it's a fashion. And I think, like Candace Owens, I think this refusal to see that there are social problems or systemic racism or systemic oppression of women or any groups is because, despite him being very vocally against ideology, he's always talking about ideology, is because actually he's a libertarian ideologue. He believes in the ideology of the individual.
Yeah.
And it's the reason he denies that climate change is a big problem. Because it's a systemic problem that can't be solved by tidying your bedroom. Tidying your bedroom means going out to a climate march. It means doing what Greta Thunberg did. And so I find these kind of statements in a time where literally our children right now are facing 40 more harvests. That's what we've got with the planet, 40 more harvests before we actually run out of soil that will produce food. And Jordan Peterson is basically telling people that their social issues are personal problems.
It's
while
the
system is killing the planet. That's my main beef with him. It's
a very interesting position, isn't it? Because it's, you know, obviously, you know, because of I'm involved in and things that I've done, like I really like the work of the mythopoetics, and I often come back to Robert Bly, you know, and one of the bits I often come back to Robert Bly because in being involved in what a lot of people would say is sort of new age or personal development kind of territories.
Yeah.
I come across what he talked about quite a lot, and one of the things that he talks about a lot is this idea of you have to have one hand in the air, one hand in the heavens, one hand in the soil, you know. And what I really like about that is, for me, it kind of brings together the balance of this idea of like, you can only change the world by changing yourself, which I think is fundamentally true, you know. There's certain problems that we are not going to self-analyze or meditate our way out of, and like climate change, and I think kind of, you know, inequality and racism and sexism are areas like that. You know, like, of course, if we all done our own work so that we no longer had any prejudice, then that's one way of curing it, right? But, you know, even Malcolm X said there's really no point having a conversation about civil rights until the oppressor gets involved in the conversation. And where I find Jordan Peterson can go sometimes is he can seem to take something that you would take on an individual level as the truth. Like,
yes.
It starts with personal responsibility, and the only change is yourself, and, you know, and all of that stuff, and that works on an individual level. Like, and even down to sort of a victim mentality. Like, yeah, if you've been oppressed, you know, if you've been the victim of something, often one of the biggest mind shift changes is to go, well, I'm just going to change what that means to me, and I'm not going to have a victim mentality. I'm going to have a thriving mentality from it, and I'm going to use that as fuel. And that's well and good on an individual level, but to then try to expand that on a system-wide level, different. You know, it's different. It's different to say to someone, listen, you sitting there and feeling sorry for yourself ain't really gonna change anything, right? You got to go out and meet the world and make the change that you want to see, and all of that sort of stuff. That's valid. But then to take that and sort of transpose that onto an entire race or an entire sex, it's very well, I mean, it's problematic, and it's a very convenient solution to every problem. It's just, well, look at you. What are you, look at yourself, take your own responsibility. But and it's where I have a problem with the sort of manifested, the people who are into sort of manifesting things, like everything I have, I manifested in some level. And you're like, are you saying that starving child in that country manifested that in some level, that's down to their thinking that in that position? You're like, no, because that doesn't work for personal responsibility. That's very convenient to the personal responsibility of oppressors to be able. That's their fault. That's their fault.
And we also want to go how about manifesting some compassion on this spiritual journey? How about, in your manifestation agenda, could you manifest some compassion for the starving people, or for in Jordan Peterson's case, for TS people, I think they commit suicide like 5 times more than your average man, TS men. And I think Peterson misrepresented what was going on with this kind of, I studied law, and I was quite interested in this topic, because it's the mandate of whether speech was mandated. And it's not mandated. Well, he claimed that you were going to be forced to call people by their pronouns. And it wasn't actually true. The Canadian Bar Association said it wasn't true. So it's like he made a claim about what was going to happen at the dentist, and then the British Dentists Association said, no, that's not actually true. So, it wasn't accurate. And to me, it's just like punching down. And I just feel, like you said about, as a man, that one of the things you do is protect the vulnerable. I feel it's such a pity that his targets always seem to be soft. And so I kind of got slightly off track there, but what I was actually thinking before when you were speaking is about his friendship, which I really enjoy, with Russell Brand, when they're engaging. And it seems that they're very different men, but somehow complement each other quite well. And I feel like, in a sense, Jordan Peterson represents this very hardline conservative position. And I mean a kind of conservative aspect of the psyche, which I actually think is really important. In other words, you don't go tearing off like a hare after the next radical idea and throw away everything you've got. You look at and carefully choose, and you're conservative in a small c sense. And Russell Brand has got a different kind of utopian vision to Jordan Peterson, who seems to have a kind of utopian vision of the perfect hierarchy, and everything working on merit, and everything's fine. And Russell Brand's one seems to let's all elevate into one beautiful oneness and equality. And I think together somehow they represent the particle and the wave. Jordan particle and Russell Brand being the wave. And I think the problem with what Jordan Peterson's thing about, tidy your own side of the street first, tidy your own bedroom, work on yourself, doing your own thing, and the problem with the manifestors, etc., is we are not just particles, we're not just waves, we're both. And I think a lot of political thinking comes from a very atomized worldview of reality, where actually everything is seen as an atom. My life, my relationship with God, my consumer patterns, and society. And from that, it's easy to take on a sort of a sense of individual responsibility, which might be really useful, but it could also descend into the kind of a narcissistic lack of connection that might account for the kind of mental health problems we see in our society. And I think, modern physics has it as that the reality is interdependence. String theory shows that interdependence is a physical reality. And if we have our economic theories or even our psychological theories based on the theory that we are essentially atoms and we look after our individual atomization, we'll be fine. Well, this is probably one of the reasons why we're destroying the planet, is because we're actually cut off psychologically from the big picture. And that's what I experience when I listen to or hear Jordan Peterson, is a man who's cut off from nature, from a kind of deeper aspect of himself, from mystery, and has kind of created constructs to explain and understand everything. And maybe one of the reasons he triggered me so much was because that was my way of protecting myself as I was growing up, to think, to analyze, to feel I controlled everything with thoughts. And I think the fact is, there are these huge unknowable waves in society, racism and different inequalities and climate collapse, and you can't just pretend, thinking we're just individuals, it feels to me kind of like an ostrich burying their head in the sand. And, if you've got really nice, comfortable sand to do that in, fine, but some people are going to, choke to death.
That's what I sort of mean about him. I mean, so is he just sort of playing devil's advocate here? Is he not in a way trying to be the sort of yin to the yang in a way? So because I often think that one of the very, very unhelpful and damaging shadows, as it were, of the personal development movement or of the New Age movement, whatever you call those things, is this kind of almost like we're so interconnected that I don't matter.
Yeah.
All that matters is that I vibrate on some sort of higher frequency, right?
Yeah.
On somehow these earthly things are beneath me, and I think that's a very harmful shadow. And I think that's what Bly was talking about when he talked about the idea of sort of they just need some mud and some blood. He would often be heard to say about men, which they need some mud and some blood, because they were up there, and our life is down here, and in some ways, the aspects of Peterson that I like is the bits where he says, "We're here. Like this is the brutal reality of life. There is no meaning. Let's just pretend there is meaning. We'll just make some meaning because there is none. And life is cruel and it's random, and you're not going to meditate your way out. And that's the sort of element of him that I like. But I do have very real fears. Not so much now, it would seem, but at some point I was like, is he a spokesman for something else here? Because it was so kind of, does he have a political agenda, was what I was thinking, because where anywhere, like what you're saying, where anywhere there was controversy or a soft target, he seemed to be there. He seemed to go, let's just blow this up. And then anyone on the right would go, you see, he's right. Those people, they're just victims and they're behaving like victims. So screw them. And although he would, would say, look at my material, look what I said. That's not what I ever said. He does seem to be able to crash in with a headline that everyone can. It's like the way he talks is he comes in with a controversial headline and then kind of disproves it and gives himself some wiggle room kind of in there. But he's still hit with the headline. It's still like "Make America Great Again." You can say what you want after that, but it's the headline that that won the election. Aims with Brexit, get it done. No one knows what that meant, but it was something that people could attach something to. And when he says something like equality is evil, although he goes on to say, listen, that's disempowering to try and make everyone equal. What we should do is just make sure everyone has the right opportunities and that our society is fair. Well, no one's going to disagree with that. But the damage has kind of been done in the headline.
Yes, I totally agree. And I think this seems to be sorry?
He will say that he's often misquoted, but he also will say, I choose my words very, very carefully. And you sort of can't have it both ways. If you're going to choose your words very, very carefully, then if you're going to come with a soundbite like that, you're going to get judged with a soundbite like that.
Definitely. I'd like to give an example of this in that shows from my article. And this is a question in Time magazine. Someone, he's asked during the Me Too movement, does the huge number of women who report some kind of sexual assault or harassment suggest that it's more than just a couple of bad actors, that it's a systemic problem? This is his answer. Well, it depends on how you define sexual assault or harassment. Where do you place the boundaries for defining that phenomena? And if it's, let's call it unwanted penetrative sex, then no, I think it's a very small minority of men who are doing most of the damage. So he's asked if harassment is a systemic problem. And he says, well, no, if you define that as men sticking their fingers, tongues, or penises into women, then no, it's only a few people.
Yeah.
So that's basically as close to a lie as I can, and an avoidance of a question as a manipulation, as I think you can come to without really. It's like he's being a lawyer for the right. You know, he's not really answering the question there. There's a dishonesty, a disingenuous, a slipperiness, a desire to win. And I find that really, you know, it is a problem. You know, most men will know women who've been abused. Most women have had nasty things happen to them that certainly I wasn't aware of before Me Too. I wasn't aware. And I think it's just, there's just something really slippery about it, and a kind of irresponsibility. And this is why I kind of see, as a man and from a conservative position, I don't trust him. And this is what I feel is such a shame when he brings so much rich content to men. And I was making some notes about the things I think he does really well. I think he's got this wonderful passion for culture. So fantastic. And like, he speaks eloquently, you know, and shows the kind of intellectual sensitivity and emotional sensitivity that men generally aren't exposed to that much. He's got a sort of sense of awe and wonder at life. And like you say, a really kind of no bullshit, life is hard. If you're finding life hard, maybe it's because life is hard.
Yeah.
Now, you can't change all of life, and you can make yourself better in different ways, and you can make yourself better than you were yesterday. These are really valuable things. And no one told me that life was hard. I didn't realize until probably my 30s even that, oh, life is actually fucking hard. I can see that it's hard for other people too. It wasn't me all along, or it wasn't just me. It's a hard course to run.
Yeah.
You know? It's a rough track. And that is good stuff. That helps men, because so many men are feeling helpless. So many women too, but he's speaking to men, and that's fine. That's good. You know, maybe women, like with the men's movement, was slow on the pace. Feminism got there first. I think he's speaking to men's wounding. What I don't like is he then slips some political ideology that is definitely going to make the climate worse. And I think also probably encourages them to feel resentful of others, encourages them to feel resentful of feminists. You know, there's that red pill thing about, you know, well, more men die off in wars than women do, and more men die of suicide. And, you know, men, I think one of the big things that kind of made me laugh in a way was you know, more men die at wars, and you never hear feminists talking about that. And I was thinking, well, it's not feminists who send men to die in wars. It's the people at the top of the hierarchy that Jordan Peterson tells us are fine. So there's something in Peterson that I just find,
It's like he sort of,
I knock on it and it's hollow, you know?
yeah, there's also like, there's inconsistencies, you know,
Yeah.
you know, because he will say that, like, you know, one of his views is that kind of things are just the way they are, you know, because they're just the way they
Yeah.
are. And then in one of his very famous lectures, which is a great, fantastic lecture, he's talking about Hitler being more evil than we could ever imagine. He's like, Hitler is more evil than you could ever imagine, and his reason for this is because he had damaged psychology. You know, he was more dangerous than we would imagine, because a rational brain at the time, at the end of World War II, would have said, let's stop spending money on slaughtering the Jews, and we'll spend that money on the war effort, and we'll win. But what Hitler did was, he said he knew he was losing, so he said, I'm going to lose, I'm just going to use the money to wipe out as many Jews as I possibly can, right? And he said that's evidence of a damaged mind. But that's also evidence of a hierarchy. That's evidence of a hierarchy that wasn't working, because yes, there was one guy with a very, very dangerous ideology, and the problem was that there was a whole structure of people agreeing with that and doing the bidding of that one powerful man.
Yeah.
Those two models don't really go together that well. You know, they don't really fit on top of each other. Yes, you know, you could say if Hitler would have done the work on himself and had sorted out his psychology, there may not have been a World War II. But like, it's also a thing to say, well, if people would have questioned and had been more compassionate and questioned more and challenged more, he wouldn't have been able to get there. He wouldn't have been able to do it.
Absolutely. If people had all been busily tidying their German bedrooms and tucking in their sheets and making them all look very, you know, schöne, then Hitler would have had even less problem. In fact, there wasn't enough resistance to Hitler.
No.
And something I noticed as well, in recently, he's asked recently about protests and about disorder. And I actually looked, I did a Google for Jordan Peterson, referring to the literal attempt at a putsch and an overthrow in the seat of power in America, the Capitol. He doesn't talk about it. He only ever talks about disorder in reference to the left. And and there was a lot, some violent protests to do with Black Lives Matter. But there are many, every year there are people killed by white supremacists in the States. I don't think anyone's been murdered by Black Lives Matter at all. So there's definitely not an even-handedness. So I just feel it's a shame. And I wonder, Laurence, you said you enjoyed the Jordan Peterson and Russell Brand interview as well. When I was listening to that, I found that I was curiously struck by the fact that both knew the territory of addiction quite well, and Russell Brand much more so than Peterson. And my impression was that Russell Brand actually knew his shadow rather better than Peterson did. And I think probably a decade at least clean and disarmingly honest about it. But also probably has less discipline and structures than Peterson had. And I felt like almost together they were the perfect example of, you know, an imperfectly wounded feminine aspect and masculine aspect. Together, somehow they became this beautiful odd couple. And I was actually listening to them, and I found myself, after Peterson said something about just picking yourself up and bloody doing something, and I have sometimes used a kind of tobacco snuff as part of cleaning, and I had a bit of a cold and I used it, but I find it quite addictive. It's got a lot of tobacco in it. I got a bit addicted again, and I went and got rid of it and buried it and burnt it, and I realized I've been galvanized by the energy of the two of them. And particularly the part that is most missing for me, which is this kind of Peterson's bloody mindedness.
Well, that's the bit.
There's something there.
That's the bit I almost find infuriating, really, with Peterson, is that I would say that 90% of what he says, I think, great. 90% is him saying, take control of your life, tidy up your own room. Life is hard. You got, wake up, put the work in. No one's going to bring anything for you. You have to do it yourself. And his stuff to young men, like, play with fear. Learn how to overcome fear. Learn how to face your anger. Learn how to do these things. Life needs you to be gregarious and brave. The world is waiting for you. All of that stuff. I'm like, go, fantastic. Let's hear more of that. And then he'll just come out with something so utterly to the right of my politics. I'm like, oh my God. And it's just, and in a way, I really like what you're saying about Russell Brand and him, because how I would describe both of them is that they're like the mate you would take to a party, and then you'd end up having to apologize to them. So,
that's true.
Brand,
for different reasons.
Yeah, you'd have to go like, listen, he's fine. He's a lovely bloke. He's just a bit of a pretentious prick sometimes, but he's all right. And the same with Peterson. You go like, listen, he talks a lot of sense, and every now and again he just gets on one and goes a bit right wing, and you're there going, oh really? Did I bring you?
And maybe this is the thing, is I thought about this, the title Hero and Villain, and I just kind of think these are great titles and great entry points to think about, but I also kind of think, is any man a hero or a villain? We all have these different aspects, and maybe there's something about when people are so exposed, and I don't think Peterson has shied from the spotlight. I think he's relished it and used it and become very, very wealthy because of it. But he's been exposed different aspects of him that others wouldn't. I mean, I know I'm a big fan of Joseph Campbell, who said, "Follow your bliss," and he wrote the book The Hero's Journey, and he did probably 70% of the legwork that Peterson now does in talking about myth. But he was an anti-Semite. He had some really dodgy statements. There's an article in the New York Book Review where he's in really good sources that have him saying some pretty awful things about Jewish people that aren't out of character for someone of his generation from a waspy American background. They're probably not dissimilar to what most people of that background may have thought.
Yeah.
It wasn't on social media. He didn't get a camera stuck in his face, asked him what he thought about Black Lives Matter. So in a sense, his legacy and his reputation is much more hallowed than Peterson will ever get the chance to be.
Yeah. Well,
I think he's used that to become rich as well, So I don't feel that sorry for him, but I do feel sorry for anybody really. At least I don't feel sorry for anybody. I don't think anyone could stand the relentlessness of 360 exposure without learning a lot about themselves would be the best outcome.
Yeah. I mean, he's definitely I guess it comes down to, do you, and this is going to be personal opinion, but do you think he's a force for good or a force for bad?
I think that's a really good question. And that's, I guess, it's a very Peterson type question, is that it really forces choice. And I actually really like this about Peterson. I think if he shut up about politics, he'd be really good. But I think any man or woman who is a leader now and isn't talking about climate change, but is actually denying climate change, he's retweeted climate change denial. He said that he's skeptical about some of the models used about climate change, is what he said. And that's like, a ballet, a contemporary dancer being skeptical about some of the models of, method acting theories. Like, who gives a shit? He's a psychologist. He doesn't know anything about climate. But the people who listen to him, which is millions of young men, the young men with the energy and power to change the world, the young men who will inherit the world that he is now at the top of, they will be affected. So I think it's really, really irresponsible. And so for that reason, I don't think he's a force for good, because I think I think he gets the biggest questions of our time times wrong. He's wrong on climate change, and he's wrong in thinking, unless the biggest threat to humanity was a transsexual flipping Godzilla that was going to arrive and force us all to call them their preferred pronoun, he's just way off target with his, his preoccupations.
And that's what I mean.
That's my main thing.
And that's what I mean. It's like, and that's why I do think the kind of hero and villain thing.
Yeah.
Because in the worst moments of Peterson, I think go, is this sleight of hand? Is this sleight of hand here? We're talking about trying to get equality. We're talking about trying to make a better world in terms of equality. And he's causing explosions by going, but do you know the law is going to say that you have to call someone them? It's almost like in the 1980s when they'd go, oh, do you know what? They're going to make it illegal for us to sing blah, blah, Black Sheep, or they're going to make it illegal for us to sing Blackboard. And it was all bull.
Exactly.
It was all rubbish. Same with Brexit, when it was like, oh, they're going to make us have straight bananas. All of that nonsense. And
EU army. And
it can be, in one hand, it can be, well, this is just a man who courts controversy, right? That's it. But you could look at another one and go, is this sleight of hand? Is this creating small explosions to undermine something that systemically is going to be for the interest of everyone? And
well, that's what programmatic.
That's where I get infuriated, because he's such a powerful orator, and he has so many people hanging on to what he says, that in terms of developing a more positive masculinity that could really enhance the world, he could be a massive voice for good in telling men to take more responsibility for their lives and show up in a more powerful way that doesn't mean me being bigger means you being smaller. But he seems not to do that in some way. He seems not just to miss that mark again and again and again. And it becomes about, we could all be better if we were actually a little bit more like me.
I agree. And I think that's probably why I feel probably more disappointed than anything else with Peterson, and why in some ways I think what we need is more female leadership. We need young people, young women. I mean, look at the people who dealt with COVID the best, and most of the leaders who dealt with COVID the best are fairly youngish and female, and I think maybe there is a certain sense of people who just don't have the right heads for the times, really. And I think with Peterson, my feeling about Peterson is he's very good at naming shadow, but I don't get the sense that he's done much of what Jung describes as kind of touching the golden shadow, where you actually transcend and transmute the shadow. I think he's very good at naming a lot of the ugly feelings that we all have and the ugly thoughts that we all have. And I think that's going to be brilliant for, when I was a young man, I thought I was my thoughts. The Dalai Lama tells us that that's one of the problems of the West. We think we are our thoughts. The thoughts we have, we think we are, which is even linguistically wrong. And I think him naming that stuff is really great. But I don't think my feeling is, for Jung says that we go to become into the mature masculine, you have to integrate the feminine. I don't feel he's integrated his feminine. It seems to me he'd rather, rail at transsexuals and women than integrate his own feminine feelings. And I think this is why him and Russell Brand are an interesting pair, because I would say probably, I love Russell Brand. I think he's just hilarious, but he's got his aspects that are, he's a bit kooky as well. I think Russell Brand has probably got work to do in strengthening his masculine in that kind of Jungian perspective, but his feminine, he's really in touch with himself and his feelings, and he knows who he is in that sense. And I think that's why they're a nice pairing. And I hope they continue to converse, because I do think somehow they're good for each other.
Like a sort of intellectual George and Mildred.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, like an intellectual and spiritual. And that's what's interesting about them, is that they're both spiritual. And Peterson accords values and spirit importance. And I think left-wing politicians are mainly technocrats, you know, and that's not very fucking inspiring, excuse my language, when really we need a feeling-based sense of we're all in it together. Otherwise, and a sense, a sentience, and maybe a spiritual one. Otherwise, I don't think we're going to survive the chaos that climate collapse will bring. And I'm just going to turn to what you said about what he says. And this for me is why ultimately I would say he's not a force for good. This is last year, I think, at Cambridge Union, and Peterson is asked if climate change should be addressed. And he's asked particularly, can we finally move on between the ideological battles of the right and left? Now we have this common problem uniting us of climate change. And Naomi Klein, who wrote Shock and Awe Doctrine and all sorts of things, and she wrote a great book on climate change called Everything, This Changes Everything. She says, yes, this is the first time humanity has ever had a common problem. This is the only good thing about climate change, is we actually have to come together. Peterson says, no, it's not. And he says the reason is basically, there's a couple of reasons why climate change isn't so much of a problem. And he says, I spent a lot of time reading, this is a quote, I worked for a UN committee on sustainable economic and ecological development, and I read a very large amount during that period of time. I learned a lot, much of which made me much more optimistic before I read the relevant literature. So the climate change issue is catastrophic, and the idea that that will unite us, well, it's not going to unite us. First of all, it's very difficult to separate the science from the politics. And second, even if the more radical claims are true, we have no idea what to do about it. So he basically says, I know more than the young woman. It was a young woman who asked me about climate change. I know more than you. It's far too complicated. Don't worry your pretty little head. I think that's what he's saying. But when you actually look at his claim to have worked for a UN Committee on Sustainable Economic and Ecological Development, it's not true. It's simply untrue. He was an advisor for a man called Jim Bout-Seal, who was the chair of the Board of Center for International Governance Innovation and Peterson was his advisor, presumably on psychology. On the 100-page report by this committee, Peterson is thanked briefly on page 96, along with the Sherpas who took the people who were on the board up Everest to have a look at the melted glaciers. In other words, he wasn't working for them because of any XP. He wasn't working for them. He was an advisor to one man who happened to be on it, and he wasn't selected because of his expertise on climate change. So to me, he's basically saying, shut up, dear.
Yeah.
It's basically like a Victorian man saying, let us smoke the cigars and talk about the world. Go and tidy your room. And frankly, fundamentally, I don't think Peterson has tidied his psychological room at all. And this sounds really harsh, Laurence, but I'm going to say it. I think a man who falls apart when his wife gets cancer and gets addicted hasn't tidied his psychological room sufficiently that he can do that important job of protecting the vulnerable, which in his case is his wife. And that's terrible, harsh judgment of a man. But he's a man who makes quite harsh judgments. And I just feel Peterson's system of psychological health and social health and political lack of actorship works, he wouldn't have been addicted and depressed. And I'm not sure he should really be lecturing teenagers on how to deal with climate change. I think he's very hubristic. And I think he's flawed, like all of us. And in a way, I think that might be, he admits the flaws he sees, and I think that might be one of the good things that gives him a lot of appeal. But I do wish he'd look a bit deeper into things as well.
Okay, thank you. I mean, we're coming up to the hour.
Yeah.
That seems like a good a place as any to draw it in. So comment there, which I like. It says, "Fear of transsexual Godzilla is a sentence I never expected to hear."
But it might be a phobia. So apologies if I've triggered anyone.
So yeah, I mean, we're not going to get to the bottom of Jordan Peterson. You know, I think he's a very, 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 very complicated character, and I think
He is.
in one way, just maybe just that stirring up of the hornet's nest is useful.
Yeah.
We drawed it there, but I don't want to let you go before I ask you the questions I ask everyone who comes on the show. So the
Sure.
first question is, how can people keep in contact, you know, find out about what you're up to? Do you have any social media that you push, anything?
Yeah, you're welcome. I am taking a pause because I've been doing a lot of Vipassana meditation recently, but I will be starting online men's circles soon based on using a lot of Mankind Project models, which are fantastic, plus what I've learned from my teacher and kind of shamanistic ritual. I'm on something called Mathnawi21, MATHNAWI, on Instagram. Clearly, I should get a more catchy name, but it's Mathnawi21. And Jamie Wrate on my Medium. You'll be able to find me then. And I'll be very happy. I find this stuff interesting. I find Jordan Peterson interesting. I'm always happy to engage with anyone who's interested in these issues.
Okay. The other question, is there a question I didn't ask that you wish I had?
Nice. Okay, if neoliberalism isn't going to work to solve climate change, what is going to work? And I would say what is going to work is partly what Peterson says is doing our work. And I think mainly the main thing is touching the collective fear and grief that we all have, I believe, and that is stirring these making these hornets' nests so goddamn fiery, I believe, is a deep cellular understanding that we have toasted our planet and that we're in peril. I think that's why we're having such heightened conversations about everything. That these birds in Australia that fly from Africa about every 5 decades, somehow intuiting that the salt lakes have become lakes and they can go and eat frogs. They just arrive, turn up from Africa. I think we're like them and we know something's wrong. We're just being lured by siren stories into believing the wrong things, whether it's QAnon or, you know, we're getting overrun by neo-Marxist, globalist transsexuals or whatever. So I think people, if we start reading climate change and voting green is the solution to the biggest problem we're facing.
Okay. Third question. If you could meet yourself as a teenager, what advice would you give yourself, knowing that you probably wouldn't listen?
I probably would have listened, because I think when I was a kid, my main thing is I just felt isolated, and I probably would have thought, who's that prick? But what would I have said? You'll be okay. You don't have to do what you think you have to do. Take your time. Take 5 years off after school before you do anything else.
Good advice.
Don't go to university for 5 years.
Good advice. And final question, what book has had the most profound influence on your life?
I think it's Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, probably. That's
come up twice, you know, when I've asked this question.
Maybe. And I actually thought about it, and I left my little booklet at home because I'm at my friend's house because I don't have any Wi-Fi. I think this is what Peterson is trying to do with his intellectual structures, is to somehow fuse this kind of Eastern intuitive understanding of the world, which can be in Jungian terms the feminine, with logos, with a kind of analytic way of perceiving the world. And that's what Zen and the Motorcycle Maintenance is all about. It's essentially trying to do that. And it drives a guy absolutely mental. Like, it's an incredible book, but after about 140 pages, it suddenly opens almost like a lotus flower in the middle of your mind, having a fairly kind of turgid beginning. It's quite hard to get through, and then suddenly it's like, my God, he's done it. It's suddenly it kind of makes sense, and I think this is something that Peterson's trying to do. I don't think he's going to do it, but I think Robert Pirsig did it in this book, and it's incredible.
Great. So go out and read that book if you haven't read it. It keeps coming up as a recommendation. So if you're listening and you're watching and you haven't read that book, then go out and read it. Okay, Jamie, thank you so much for coming on.
Great. Yeah.
Real pleasure to have you here on Thursday for Knowledge. To anyone who's watching this in the group, please remember that we do this every week at 3:30 p.m. every Thursday. And if you're watching this on YouTube, then why not come and join the Magnificent Man Project Facebook group and get more involved in the conversation. Also, if you are watching this on YouTube, then do subscribe, press the bell to get notifications. Okay, thank you everyone for
listening. So much, Laurence. And yeah, join the Facebook group, guys. It's really nourishing stuff. Thanks, mate. Appreciate your time.
See you later. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.